Hello, everyone. This is Malik, and on behalf of Verizon and S&P Global Market Intelligence, I would like to welcome you all and say thank you for attending today's virtual roundtable titled Secure Access Service Edge Roundtable, Practitioner Insights and Learnings in Asia Pacific Region. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. To ask a question, simply type it in the question box on your screen. The presentation slides will be available for download in the resource section in the console. And finally, the on-demand version of this virtual roundtable will be available shortly after the live event concludes. With that, we welcome our speakers today, and I'll turn it over to Mark to introduce himself and kick off this event.
Thank you very much, Malik. Appreciate it. Yeah, so excuse me, I'm Mark Ehr. I'm a senior consulting analyst here at S&P Global. And I want to thank our Verizon folks for joining me today for this virtual roundtable. I focus exclusively on cybersecurity. I've been in the business almost 40 years, hard to believe. So yes, I started when I was 10. And here at S&P, lately, my focus, as you might guess, has been secure access service edge, as well as some of the other emerging technologies, including some fun ones like generative AI and so on. So anyway, yeah, I'll turn it over to Rob and let him introduce himself, and then Rob can turn it over to John.
Thanks, Mark. Wonderful to be here with you today, and thank you everyone for joining us on this webcast today. My name is Rob Labusk. I'm the Regional Vice President for Verizon here in the Asia Pacific region. And I've been with Verizon for 20 years. Similar to Mark, I joined when I was 10 also. For the vast majority of that 20 years, I've been working in our business in the Asia Pacific region, working with customers large and small, enterprises and governments throughout the APAC region on their digital transformation and cybersecurity journeys. I truly believe the Asia Pacific region is the most dynamic, fast-moving, and rapidly growing technology sector in the world. That's what keeps me energized every single day for us to show up and work with our customers in this region and help them to unlock value through technology. So it's great to be here today. Mark, looking forward to the conversation. John, I'll hand over to you for an intro.
Thanks very much, Rob, and welcome everyone. Great to have you here at today's session. My name is John Hines. I head up Verizon's cyber security business across Asia Pacific and Japan. Similar to Rob, I think I've been with Verizon for almost 20 years and been in the cyber security space for the last 23 years. My role covers all of Asia Pacific as well as Japan, based here in Canberra in Australia, but spend most of my time on the road across the region with my team, helping our clients out with their largest cyber challenges.
Oh, very good. All right, moving right along. Thanks, John. All right, so let me give you a quick introduction to, not to the topic necessarily. I assume that by virtue of the fact that you're attending this, that you know what SASE is, at least at some level. But we did conduct a study which yielded some really, really interesting facts and trends, which we're going to talk about today. So we were really looking to study adoption trends, decision-making criteria, in other words, why people were moving towards SASE, deployment methods, the benefits that were realized from SASE, as well as lessons learned. And this was all encapsulated into a full-length paper. I will be providing the link to that paper if you'd like to read it in depth. So I encourage you to do that, because this is more of a teaser, if you will, just to kind of glance across the top of the topic, and of course talk a little bit with John and Rob about their experience in the field as well. So this was a qualitative study, which means that rather than going out and doing a formal, like a study, a poll, or you maybe interview hundreds or thousands of people, rather than do that, we did in-depth interviews. So we did 10 of those, which were 30 to 40 minute, just face-to-face over Zoom kind of thing, which were conducted in late 2022. And then We followed on with a 3-day, what we call an online executive discussion board, or EDB, where we had 20 participants, and 10 of those participants were from Asia Pacific and 10 of those were from Europe, and they were all conducted online, as I mentioned, and it took 3 days. And really what we were after with the 3 days, we were splitting the topic into these 3 key areas, which I'll discuss in just a minute here. So as I mentioned, the participants were evenly split between Europe and Asia Pacific. They're all from a very wide variety of industries, all the way from mining on one end, manufacturing, retail, hospitality, you name it. We had a really wide variety of industries. And the organizations were by and large mid to large enterprises. And that means over 1,000 employees in Europe and over 5,000 employees in Asia Pacific. The other key thing was that all the participants lead or are involved in SASE. So they were the decision makers, in some cases the implementers, and the practitioners. And on the average, they had 20 years of experience in the field. So like all of us here, we all have some gray hair, and they probably have more gray hair than we do because they're involved in security every day. So titles included like Chief Information Security Officer, CIO, CTO, Regional Security Head, and so on. So these are pretty high level, pretty, roll up the sleeves type of people. So today we're going to focus on those 3 key areas I alluded to a minute ago, which was what we discussed in the 3 days of those of the executive discussion board. The first is key factors driving the shift to SASE. The second is top reported benefits from it. And then lastly, barriers, outcomes, and lessons learned from the projects. All right, so real quick, let's go through a success story. And I always like to lead with this type of thing because, it describes in real terms what somebody received from deploying a technology. So in this case, and this was not surprisingly echoed amongst many of the people we spoke with, was the pandemic was a huge driver. In this case, though, it was fairly extreme because they had started with just as a traditional brick and mortar office. They were an insurance company, and they had literally thousands of people working in the office every day. Very few were on the road or working from home. And then all of a sudden, everything changed with the pandemic. The other problem they had was an issue with response time. So and this company continues to grow and did grow even through the pandemic. So the problem was when they would bring in new employees, they had to provision devices internally, which took 10 to 15 days. And during that period, they were pretty much non-productive because they had to have a hardened machine provided by the company. Well, one of the big benefits of SASE was it allowed them to onboard employees and have them use their own devices, which allowed them to become immediately productive. And that was huge. So basically, that was the genesis of the product, or the project rather. Then they went, after they got the BYOD and the remote user problem solved, then they were able to go into other areas and expand. So yeah, really a great success story there, and it completely transformed their business because it allowed them to have remote workers working from anywhere and allow them to hire someone and get them immediately productive. Okay. Oh, and I should mention, so the format for this session, this is a virtual roundtable. So what we're going to do from this point forward is I'm going to just introduce the concept and just touch on a few points on this slide, and then I'm going to open it up. So Rob and John, you can feel free to jump in at any point if you want to add some color commentary or whatnot to the topic. So as I mentioned, like in the executive discussion boards, we split it into 3 days. So the first day was really about trying to figure out why people were shifting to SASE. It's kind of interesting because SASE is only a few years old, and it's just been monumental in the amount of organizations that are moving to it. Even S&P, the organization I work for, we just deployed SASE about 6 months ago, and I'll talk about my experience a little bit later on as well. So what was driving it? Well, obviously the pandemic was a big one, but really at a higher level, we split it into business, technical, and technical drivers. So one of them was increasing business agility. There's a lot of digital transformation projects that are going on right now. And I think what a lot of firms are understanding is that in order to pull off a full digital transformation project, they have to be a lot more agile and they have to shift. They can't just use a lot of the legacy systems, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later on as well. They also want to improve user experience and support for hybrid work, as we spoke about a minute ago with the pandemic, and then also reducing risk and improving compliance. On the technical side, it's all about modernization, network, security, IT infrastructure, authentication, identity and access management systems, as well as managing growing infrastructures, and that kind of spreads out into the attack surface problem. Nowadays, between cloud, work from home or remote workers, IoT and OT integrations, the attack surfaces are just spreading at a monumental rate, and so they realize that they need to do something to help contain that. Vendor consolidation and cost reduction was also a technical driver, but much less so than some of the other drivers. And then the combined business and technical drivers were really around, again, IT cost reduction, modernization of security, improving responsiveness was a big one, securing growing attack surfaces, and along with that, using zero trust and least privilege principles. There's a couple quotes from the study there. I'll let you guys read those. But anyway, I'll open it up. Rob and John, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I love that success story that you spoke through a couple of minutes ago for a few reasons. Firstly, it's a living timeline of the journey and the experience that many customers and clients have gone on over the last 2 to 3 years. That experience of having to respond to pandemic, to changed operating environment very rapidly, and then understanding and appreciating the value that they can unlock from that, and migrating onto a SASE architecture to help solve some of the issues that they had previously. Ultimately, I've often said from a technology perspective that the enduring legacy of the pandemic will be that as an accelerant rather than an inhibitor. It's really fueled and accelerated already existing digital transformation or technology migration strategies that have been in place. But the learning from the pandemic was that it was a really broad spectrum of both readiness and capability for customers. Some were already on that transformation journey, had already, for instance, deployed software-defined architecture, and so the acceleration and migration to a SASE architecture was somewhat easier. Some were at a standing start, and so they needed to do many things at the one time. The other aspect that I like about that particular success story is it talks about this idea of the real business benefit. And I mean, who hasn't worked in IT for more than a minute and a half and heard stories about long provisioning times and how long it takes you to get provisioned and get access to networks and the like on traditional VPN type architectures? Well, this idea of rapid provisioning and rapid access really solves what I think is the first principal issue that we're all trying to solve, which is connecting dynamic users to dynamic applications. And SASE just provides incredible capability and uplift in order for us to be able to do that as organizations. John, perhaps you'd like to comment on the changed security environment and the uplift that it's brought there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I guess one of the biggest benefits from a SASE perspective is around securing growing attack surfaces. So if you think of, the traditional way that we've worked, we've had, largely a corporate entity that's had a moat around it. We've had data centers with applications in it. Staff will come into work in the morning, they'll leave in the afternoon. They may use historical sort of VPNs to dial in and do bits and pieces of work and so forth from that perspective. But if we have a look now, and even before the pandemic, with the proliferation of technology, mobile devices, different ways of working, bring your own devices and all those sorts of things, the attack surface has just increased exponentially and continues to do so. So how do you move from that old, bridge and moat scenario to securing all of those assets, no matter where they are, no matter who's using them, and no matter how they're connecting into your network? So I think, certainly from that perspective, there's a massive benefit to deploying a SASE stack.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think elasticity is one key term there. Being able to be flexible. I think zero trust, at least privilege, is huge, particularly with the spread of, as you mentioned, of devices and users all over the estate. Certain things are in the cloud, certain things may be still on premise, but if you can use zero trust and really encapsulate security down to that level, that makes just a massive difference. And one thing that one of the CISOs said to me during the process was that he said, we understand that we're still going to be breached because that's just a reality. But what it will do is if we are breached and we're using a true zero trust methodology, it will minimize the boom, if you will, minimize the potential damage and allow us to encapsulate it and shut it down much faster than in the old approach, where if someone was coming in over a VPN, for example, a lot of times they would have access to a large swath of the network. And so it's just a complete sea change over the old ways of doing things.
And
right,
just
go ahead.
I was talking with a client, a fairly new client in Asia a couple of weeks ago, and one of the key, tenets or fundamental things you need to do is understand where all your assets are across your organization. And talking with this client, not only did they not know where dozens of their assets were, they were actually unaware that they had branch offices in certain regions and certain countries. So, for a CISO, for a security professional, that's that certainly would keep you up at night.
Absolutely, for sure. Yeah, and we'll talk more about that particular topic in a minute as well. So we have a question from the audience. The pandemic was clearly a driver for many SASE deployments, naturally. Now it is mostly behind us. Do you think the pace will continue? I'll take a swag at that and go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's a great question, and I think it's on the minds of many IT executives at the moment. I've come through this rapid change and response period. How does that inform my strategy going forward? Well, certainly what we're seeing when we go and speak with enterprise and government customers in this region is it's continuing to actually accelerate. And it's for two primary reasons. The first is there's intrinsic cost benefit to moving to SASE architecture, but perhaps not during the migration itself, where you, in some cases, have to run dual assets and manage complex projects and migration strategies, but certainly at the end point, when you consider deployed network assets and what you're housing virtually in cloud infrastructure, there is a significant cost benefit to be realized. The second aspect is, as John alluded to, the attack surface and the threat landscape is ever increasing, and it's becoming more sophisticated. So the ability to containerize, for instance, applications or servers that are under attack is really important. That's where something like virtual firewalls in the cloud create this great benefit in a SASE architecture. So it's unlocking elements and aspects of the entire SASE stack to deliver value. But two key trends. The first is realizing, now that you're on the journey, realizing and unlocking the cost benefit with a fully implemented solution, and secondarily, preparing yourself for new threats and an ever-increasing complexity in the cybersecurity landscape. They're the two reasons that our customers are telling us that they're continuing to accelerate their efforts.
Yeah, and that certainly dovetails with what we're seeing as well. If anything, SASE is just going to accelerate just because it makes sense. Everyone understands they need to modernize, and regardless of the pandemic, that certainly accelerated and maybe even lit a fire under some of those projects, but certainly I don't see it slowing down at all. All right, thanks. All right, moving on. All right, now next, let's turn to SASE deployment approaches. So what we found is that a lot of organizations, not surprisingly, had very different approaches to deploying. Some of them went with pilot sites, which is to say, let's just pick one office or a few branch offices and let's get it going and see how it works. Or it might have been, with a certain group of users or whatever it might be. Others went with a low risk, quick win approach, and the idea there was, let's pick not a terribly risky set of users or applications, but let's get it in, test it out, show that it's providing value, and then that provides the impetus in really the business justification to move on and accelerate. Another group really went with the highest risk, highest value, and that to me means that there was pain. They had pain, like the success story at the very beginning. They realized very quickly, because of the pandemic, that they needed to shift and support remote work, and along the way they figured out they could reduce their implementation times, or sometimes it's a compliance issue. They're having compliance audit failures or whatnot, and they just realize that they need to modernize quickly. The last one, which we didn't see as much, is the big bang approach, which is to say, let's just do everything at once. And naturally, it's probably, especially as organizations get larger, that's just not a real reality for a lot of organizations. So, and then you see the quotes there on the left there. I think, like, if the one in the middle there kind of is somewhat typical, which it was all about basic access first to support remote workers, and then it was about business critical targets and high risk estates with quick wins peppered in between. That's kind of a good pragmatic way of approaching it. I don't know, do you two have any comments you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, great observations there, Mark. We're seeing obviously a proliferation of piloting and testing. And it's not so much about customers testing the technology to see whether it stands up. It's actually more about them testing their design principles and the assumptions that they've made about their own infrastructure and their own application performance. So it's helping them in a small way or a contained way test what a broad-based deployment would look like. And the interesting thing that we're seeing is once a pilot has proved successful and they've tested and proved out those assumptions and those architectural guidelines that they themselves have conceived, then they're ready to go forward with, I wouldn't call it highest risk, highest value, but a broad-based rapid deployment. The other thing is, to your observation, we're seeing almost no enterprise-grade customers go for big bang type of deployments. I mean, the reality is there are very few true cloud-native companies out there when you think about IT architecture. And a big bang SASE deployment can only really be contemplated if you already have, cloud-based architecture at the core of your operating model, from your databases all the way up to your applications and user access. So I think there's a broad palette there, but certainly piloting to rapid deployment or broad-based deployment is an area that we've seen grow quite rapidly, particularly in the last 18 months as companies have moved out of their pandemic response settings.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Rob. And I think, one of the key things from a SASE deployment perspective is, it needs to be well planned and well executed. You're dealing with some complexities from the network side of things, complexities from the security side of things. You're dealing with, risk profiles. You're dealing with business processes. All of those things need to be very carefully planned, and then executed in order for a successful outcome from a SASE deployment. And I think, unless you've done that, particularly for large organizations from a big bang perspective, that's highly risky for those organizations. For smaller organizations, perhaps a little less risky. But in our experience, people are generally taking the other approaches as opposed to the big bang approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Rob, I think you hit the nail on the head there. When you were talking about, there's just very few organizations that are entirely cloud. They're working to go there, but they're certainly not there. And we'll talk a bit more about that coming up when we get into the barriers and lessons learned. So we've got another question. Let's see. This one is: we are a medium-sized organization with a fairly high risk tolerance. What do you feel the benefits would be for the big bang deployment approach versus the highest risk, highest value approach? I think we did a pretty good job of covering that as far as why you wouldn't want to do big bang. But, I think as the question kind of implies, highest risk, highest value tends to be the ones that, if there's a sense of urgency there, that's where even the organizations that have high risk tolerance tend to go, just because obviously you're showing value quickly. Do you guys have any thoughts?
Perhaps the only other thing to add there, Mark, I think you've summarised it well, and thanks for the question for the attendee that asked it. But the reality is that if you are really looking for an additional benefit for the big bang, if your risk tolerance level was there, it might actually be outside the SASE deployment itself. It might be a second order impact around perhaps your IT organisation and the structure. One of the things that we've observed with many of our enterprise customers is this interesting relationship reset between IT operations and security operations, or the CIO and the CISO, when you consider SASE design principles, because it requires them to work very differently. But in some cases, there's an opportunity to bring organizations together and reframe how your IT structure works. So perhaps there's something along those lines that you can think about as a second or third order benefit. Ultimately, however, the benefits are going to be unique and specific to each organization based on their current circumstances and what they're seeking to achieve.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because we did hear from a number of our participants in our study about the increased efficiencies that they were seeing. Every organization is having problems with finding skilled security analysts, and because their SASE is typically an integrated stack, sort of the single pane of glass idea, it does tend to increase efficiencies, reduce time to respond and time to resolve issues, and so on too. So that was definitely brought up by a number of participants. Okay, let's move along. All right, so let's shift to the benefit side of the conversation. So we basically segmented the benefits into three buckets, if you will: IT security, business, and users. And the reason you don't see anything for users on here is because they just didn't fall into the top five. But basically, if you look at the top two, was IT security, reduced attack surface and susceptibility to vulnerabilities, and on the business side, improved IT security, which is kind of the same thing. And then the next one down was the reduced risk of attacks and breaches from the business perspective. So risk is obviously a key consideration there. And then the bottom two were on the IT side: better privileged user control and management, and adaptability to growing cloud IT and IoT and edge infrastructure. So in other words, digital transformation. And look at the quotes again on the right side. There were some really great things that people had to say about it. The one at the top, I think, is pretty interesting, where, it was very common that they had a user credential for each and every server or application, and that just resulted in an explosion of credentials and basically made it untenable to manage. And so by basically forcing them into a more structured methodology, that helped out considerably and reduced the number of credentials. Plus, also, because of zero trust, reduces what the users have access to what they should have access to, and only that. So, the least privilege principle. All right, so you guys want to chime in?
Yes, I think, certainly from a reduced attack surface perspective, I think micro-segmentation goes a long way to assisting from that perspective. If there is a breach, it goes a long way to, containing that attack basically across your enterprise. And as we've seen, many attacks can spread like wildfire. They can bring an organization to their knees. The ability to shut that particular attack down with something such as micro-segmentation, I think provides huge benefits from that perspective. So really that, the reduction of that attack surface, which we mentioned before, is growing on a daily basis, really helps to control that from a security perspective.
You're exactly right, John. And, the interesting thing here is that 100% of respondents said that it reduces the attack surface and improves IT security. There's a real big gotcha in those two statements, and everyone on this call would appreciate, IT professionals would appreciate, that a large part of our role as technology executives is educating and managing expectations of the C-suite more broadly about the investment versus return. And so one of the dialogues that we help many of our customers with is taking those what seem like absolutes and describing the fact that it's about risk minimization and opportunity minimization for bad actors. It won't remove totally the risk of a breach or a vulnerability being exploited. And so there's a fine balance to strike there between understanding exactly the benefit that you're seeking to extol and how you sell that to the C-suite for funding and support, but then also helping to manage expectations around the actual security benefit that this will realize. And that's why working with partners and with your industry and vendor community is just so important, even once you've gone through the SASE architecture redesign and deployment. Cybersecurity is constantly changing, and therefore your posture and approach need to be constantly changing as well.
Absolutely. All right, probably a good time to take another question. This one reads, I read from the report, which they're referring to the customer report that we based on this data, that user benefits were also realized. What was the top SASE benefit from the user's perspectives? And as I recall, and I'm speaking from personal experience as well, because as I mentioned here at S&P, we went through a SASE project about 6 months ago. It's absolutely improved user experience. The fact that you can be anywhere on any internet connection and just fire up your applications and work. You don't have to worry about connecting to the VPN or if the VPN drops or any of those sorts of things. It's just, it was magical. It was almost like they flipped a switch and all of a sudden you just didn't have to worry about a VPN anymore. You could just work just as if you were in an office, which was incredible.
Magical, Mark. That's a great word. I love hearing that word when people describe technology change. You don't hear it often enough.
Absolutely.
But look, I think from a user perspective, it is about ease of access and performance. And going back to what I said at the start of the call, first principles, connecting dynamic users to dynamic applications. If we can make that more frictionless and more seamless, then we're doing our job in service of our users. The other benefit, of course, comes from the intrinsic management of a multi-vendor or highly complex architecture to a more simplified one. Now, I think we're probably going to get to shortly what remains the single biggest strategic decision for SASE network deployment or SASE architecture deployment, which is, do I go for a best of breed SASE stack, or do I go for single vendor and a true single pane of glass? So critical question to answer strategically, and depending upon the answer you provide to that as part of your SASE strategy, will then flow down to benefits that you could see within the IT organization, within ops in terms of managing, as well as the ability to deploy and manage identities and access as well. So two dimensions there. John, from a security perspective, there are some very early wins that you can get, particularly from a user perspective.
Yeah, certainly. And one of those wins is around authentication. So, getting rid of the multiple kind of authentication mechanisms for you to ultimately get to the application that you're looking to use or that you use on a regular basis. I guess the other thing is around, real-time application optimization. So the ability for the SASE to deliver that application to you as quickly as possible, using all the smarts of SASE from that perspective. That reduces frustration, increases productivity. We've all worked with those applications in our careers that tend to clunk along. They may be backhauled through 3 different, countries from a cost perspective. And we've all sort of shared the frustrations around that. So, certainly from an efficiency perspective, SASE definitely assists from that perspective. And Mark, it sounds like you're experiencing some of those benefits since you guys have implemented SASE.
Yeah, absolutely. One other thing that occurred to me before we move on was this concept of privileged user control and management, which, as a former practitioner, with privileged access, one of your worst nightmare would be to be hacked, phished. Someone gets your identity and then uses that to conduct an exploit, right? And one of the things that struck me that's really, really cool about SASE is that, not only because of microsegmentation, not only does it sort of reduce the potential effect if that were to happen, but they also, many of the vendors have incorporated things like time-limited access for privileged users, which I think is super cool, which means that, once you authenticate, you do your thing, and then that access expires after 15 minutes or whatever it is. So that even if someone were to be able to get in that way, there was just a limited window of opportunity where they could, do a lateral spread. I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example of the benefit, Mark, and certainly from our research with our data breach investigation report, we know that privilege misuse is one of the top 3 or 4 attack vectors for the last 16 years. So it's an issue that's well known and it's not going away. And so if you accept that it's a very mature attack vector and one that is being used time and again for exploitation, then these new sorts of technology gates, if you will, and controls that SASE allows for is a great way for us to remediate and address that issue. And you're exactly right. I mean, privileged access is important for organizations, but of equal importance is the ability to control it in a logical way, such that you're reducing that opportunity for misuse. So a really great observation as to one of the benefits, I think.
Yeah. I think as well, we see on a regular basis with conversations with clients, particularly around latent users. So an Active Directory may have 25,000 employees in it, but the company may have, 11,000 employees. So I think that rigor and that cadence around ensuring, onboarding an employee right the way through to offboarding that employee to ensuring all the access to all the applications, essentially killing that the access of that user in the system. And we see a lot of organizations don't do that, which is a little bit concerning, I guess.
Absolutely. There have been many well-publicized in your DBIR, your report, incidents where, an employee had not been deprovisioned and they came back in even months later and wreaked havoc. So absolutely want to tighten that up. Okay, let's move along. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the top barriers that were encountered. I found this really interesting and not terribly surprising, but the concept of technical debt, which, in case you don't know that term, that may be an Americanism, that basically says that's the debt of older systems, the kind of the tax, if you will, that is applied to a project like SASE that you have to work through before you can do it, before you can successfully deploy it. In fact, one CISO who had just completed their SASE migration said, basically, data. And what he meant by that was understand where your data is, because that is key. And secondarily, applications. So really understanding that architecture. So as you can see, that's number 1 and number 2 on this chart, is around understanding your technical debt and mapping out the legacy systems, as well as understanding your current IT architecture so that you can map that out. And then, as you see, dropping off rapidly, business justification. It's interesting because obtaining budget really wasn't a big concern, a big consideration or barrier for a lot of the folks we spoke with. And I think it's because a lot of organizations just sort of understood that this is something they needed to do. Maybe it was, obviously the pandemic drove a lot of it, but a lot of them too, they're actively involved in digital transformation projects. And you sort of hit a wall where you just understand you need to modernize your identity and access management stack, or you're not going to be able to go much further. And so, we really didn't see a lot of folks bringing up budget as an issue. Lack of staff definitely came up. management of the implementation. This is all stuff that's pretty typical for, I think, for any security project. Architectural design, there are a lot of nuances to, especially in a very complex organization. So that came up a few times. Internal and cultural challenges. Some people indicated that there were parts of the organization that didn't want to change, which is also very typical of of a new technology where people just don't trust it or they don't want to change. And then issues with contractors and vendors and cost overruns were distant at the end there. So anyway, so yeah, that was really the net of what most people talked about was this concept of technical debt. You guys want to chime in?
Probably, I mean, as you said, no great surprises in these responses, Mark, and legacy systems, IT architecture, and understanding the migration strategy. One that is quite surprising is staffing and lack of staff and capability. Every single CIO that I speak to in the Asia Pacific region tells me that the war on talent is only becoming more profound and increasing exponentially. And it's not just finding people within the IT sector, but it's finding people with the right skills and the right capabilities. And I think the unique aspect of SASE architecture and a consideration for IT executives as they cast their minds 3 to 5 years into the future is the requirement for a combination of both security as well as networking skills. In a lot of cases, in the one project team, or in some cases, in the same engineer or the same engineering group. And so the shifting and changing of knowledge and skills requirements is really quite interesting, and probably one that I would reasonably expect we see increase if we were to do this particular study again in 12, 18, 24 months. And mind you, I say all of that before we even start layering on top of all of this things like artificial intelligence or Gen AI, machine learning, and other levels of high processing automation in the IT environment, which add just another layer of complexity again. But, really interesting commentary from this user group in the Asia-Pac region.
I think as well, just on the cultural challenges. So if you think about SASE, you're dealing with the network part of the organization, you're dealing with the security part of the organization. In a traditional sense, they've kind of operated separately, and a lot of organizations are configured that way. The network folks are there to kind of speed things up, access to applications. These bad security guys are there to, tell us no and slow things down and sort of ruin the user experience. And so I think, in our experience with a SASE deployment, one of the key fundamental things, which is not a technology thing, but it is how do we get buy-in from both the network and the security folks? How do we convey the benefits of a SASE solution to both of those and the benefits to the organization? And then how do we bring them together in order to move things forward from a SASE perspective? So not a technology issue, rather a sort of people challenge or a cultural challenge, and certainly something that we've seen at the beginning of many deployments across the globe.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's a really important point. One of the questions we asked in this study was, we were interested in learning which group led the project. And if one, by group, I mean network versus security, right? And really what we found is that these projects tend to be kind of like marriage counseling, right? Where you have these two sides and they have to work together in order to accomplish this goal. One cannot successfully pull it off without the other. And so I think, to your point, it has caused these groups to, in some cases, actually physically integrate, in other cases, functionally, where they have to work much closer together, because this involves both, right? It's really important to achieve that cultural goal as well as the technical goal. All right, and we got a question here. We may have answered this already. I see from this chart that technical debt, legacy systems, and understanding current IT architecture were the top problems encountered. Can you provide any advice on how to minimize these barriers? I don't know, do you guys have any additional wisdom you want to throw in?
Well, minimizing legacy systems and tech debt is a really tough one. It's almost an oxymoron in some respects. I think more important would be, how do I, if I accept that I've got a complex legacy environment, how do I assess and plan for the migration? There's a few things to consider. First is application migration, application modernization, and then migration. So what steps do I need to take there? How am I going to sequence those applications such that I don't break process flows or business processes that are reliant on multiple applications in the stack? I think the other piece that many IT executives grapple with is the idea of stranded assets. And so as I move from legacy systems, whether it's a data center infrastructure with hardware in my firewall estate, for instance, to a SASE architecture and a virtualized stack, what does it mean for me as I manage that migration from a financial perspective? It's the other key thing to think about. But all of that I just described can really be wrapped up in ensuring that you've got a holistic SASE strategy and spending the time and effort to think about the guiding principles, what you're seeking to achieve, and then what those strategic steps are to both migrate and then optimize will help you to address many of those questions as to what you might do or how you might manage your legacy systems and technical debt.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And depending on the legacy application, there's, potentially APIs, application connectors, all of that needs to kind of go into that planning. It may be the case that, some of these legacy systems are just too old, and then, it's how do you sort of plan around that or plan to migrate onto a more sort of modernized, system from that perspective. The other part, I think was mentioned in the question was around IT architecture. So, it's a great opportunity whilst planning for a SASE implementation to review that IT architecture, to understand its linkages to, business process, to applications, to users, to data, all of those sorts of things. And a good opportunity, I guess, to kind of clean house and modernize things from an IT architecture perspective as well. I'd say a couple of the key things there, which we've sort of mentioned a couple of times, I think, through this session, is really around understanding where those IT assets are. We mentioned before the spread of the attack surface. You've got people all over the globe in coffee shops, at home, in hotels, on varying devices, accessing applications and so forth on your network as well. So, how do you redefine that and sort of bring that together as well, from an IT architecture perspective?
Yeah, that's great. That brought up a thought too. One of the things that we were looking into in this study was the relationship between digital transformation and these SASE projects. In other words, were they doing SASE as a greater part of the transformation, or were they being run as independent projects? Typically, it was the latter. It was independent projects. But what we did find is that, particularly with the remote worker scenario, is that a lot of times the desire to enable the remote workers also drove the digital transformation priorities. So in other words, I've got these remote users, they need access to, applications X, Y, and Z. And so those are the ones we're going to modernize first, right? So it's kind of an interesting relationship that's going on in between those two.
It certainly is, Mark, and I think the key word there is enablement. The realization that SASE architecture is a component of digital transformation, but it's actually a key enabler of everything else that might sit under that digital transformation strategy. Another great example is, think of a distributed contact center where you've got agents no longer sitting in a center but working remotely. SASE architecture helps to enable those users in a very different way comparative to them having to come into a location. That might be part of a full digital transformation strategy, but without the SASE principles in place, really difficult to implement.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, this brings up our final slide, which is an eye chart. I'm not going to read every one of these, but I put this up here. This came directly out of the report that I mentioned. And this summarizes all the advice the security leaders provided, or at least the high points. And, I'll, if you guys have anything in particular you want to bring out here, but basically, the sort of span, the lifespan, if you will, if you go left to right of, of one of these projects.
I think it's a great explanation and a blueprint, if you will, for the considerations for that SASE journey. Mark, if you leap out at me, creating a holistic SASE strategy, we talked about that earlier. This idea of standardizing and reusing architectural principles as well as application or design principles within your deployment is going to save you time, energy, and ultimately cost. John alluded earlier to the interrelationship between SASE architecture and SASE deployment and identity and access management. And if you have the ability to pre-implement IAM as a system, it can help to streamline and accelerate your deployment as well. And then the final one that leaps out at me under vendor partner evaluation is that what is really a very critical strategic question, which is multi-vendor or single stack. What's right for my organization? What's going to provide me with the best possible outcome based on the strategy that I've devised for my organization? And the single biggest decision point that we've come across with our customers when they consider that question is not the technology, it's not the features and functions, it's not even the cost, it's the skills to manage it. And whether I need to go and acquire those skills, or I need to rely on a partner to manage it on my behalf, or whether I want to manage it in-house, and what I need to do to upskill or reskill my team to make sure I've got the right people with their hands on the tools. They're the ones that leap out for me. John, what about through a security lens?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And not just from a security technology perspective. I sort of mentioned it before. SASE is a kind of collision of two worlds on that network side of things, on that security side of things. This is a great opportunity to identify and upskill both folks in the security side of the house, but also folks on the network side of the house as part of that sort of SASE transformation. And it's a good opportunity to excite folks about newer technologies and upskill them and help sort of move their careers on from that perspective as well. So I think, in terms of planning, it's not just what tech do we need, how do we deploy it, when do we switch it on? There's a whole range of different things. And that's why over to the left, the sort of initial research, the planning, the deployment strategy, all of those things are absolutely critical and interdependent. And considering, the lifeblood of your organization is the data, the applications, and obviously your staff, you want to make sure that you get all of those components right and planned out properly before that deployment.
Absolutely. That's great stuff. Okay, with that, I'm going to thank John and Rob for your time. Just a few conclusions. So, what we found very, very clearly, which is unlike many of the studies we do, SASE really show that it is really strong business sense for most organizations involved in digital transformation. You could say not only many, but probably almost all, which is fueling the growth of it naturally. And that's, through reducing risk, improving user experience, enabling your remote workers, improving compliance, and so on. And then just as an enabler for the digital transformation process. Not surprisingly, there are a lot of vendors. We counted at least 20. Within our small sample size, we had 20 vendors that were mentioned. Now, obviously, those were the the larger lists that were then shortlisted, but there are a lot of them out there. So be very careful with your vendor selection. Some only provide a partial solution. That might be okay, depending on what your stack looks like and what your needs look like. But obviously this is a major investment. So be very, very careful. Involve experts to help with that. You guys have any parting comments you'd like to make?
Thank you very much, Mark, for the opportunity to participate, and thank you to all of the participants who dialed in today. I just put a pin in that final one. Be careful with vendor selection. As you said, it's a rapidly growing, very rich offering out there in the market across SASE architecture and solutions. Rely on your trusted partners. Rely on the organizations that you've worked with in managed services who understand and know what those vendors can do and help you get the right answer for your organization.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks very much, Mark, and everyone who's attended. I wish you all the best on your SASE journey. I think my email is on one of the beginning slides. If there are any further questions or you want to hear about some of the great things we've done around the globe from a SASE deployment perspective, lessons learned, those sorts of things, please, by all means, feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Fabulous. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Malik to take us out. Thanks, everybody.
That concludes our virtual roundtable for today. Thank you, Mark, Rob, and John. As a reminder, the on-demand version of this event will be available shortly. On behalf of S&P Global Market Intelligence and Verizon, thank you for attending and have a great day.